just a time to be in community and enjoy one another and have good conversation. And you know, we know these COP meetings are always filled with highs and with lows, as we're all focused on trying to get to those outcomes that are critical and ambitious, and we know that we need. But COPs are also an opportunity to do this, to be in community, to support one another, and importantly, to really fill up our reservoir of both hope and commitment to acting on the climate crisis. And I just want to say that we really appreciate all of the steadfast and very difficult work done by all of you and so many others at these convenings, particularly when it is most challenging. So, and we all know that we're meeting at a time when those things, community and hope and steadfast and difficult work, are desperately needed. Because in the wake of elections all around the world, and certainly in my home country of the United States, it's obvious that our work to fight the climate crisis is going to be even harder. Some people and some politicians are saying that we can't afford to address the climate crisis, or even that it's a misguided hoax, despite all the evidence and all the science to the contrary. But we all know that the price of inaction is far, far higher, and that fuels us. So last year we all saw that there were some promising commitments at COP28 in Dubai. Parties said that they would aim to they agreed to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency by 2030, and transition away from fossil fuels. Now, sadly, there's been virtually no follow-up on transitioning away from fossil fuels. And the IEA recently told us that, with a report, that far, far more must be done, and quickly, to meet our renewable energy and energy efficiency goals. Because while the transition to a clean energy future is happening, and it cannot be stopped or derailed by any misguided politician, it still needs to be supercharged. And I know that all of us, including the Climate Reality Project and its 3.5 million person network, are going to fight even harder and with more creativity to continue to make progress toward the future that we all want and all need. And we can start today with this event. Today's discussion is all about closing the gap between the rhetoric and the reality of making that transition that we need, between setting goals and the work of implementation, and mobilizing the wherewithal to solve the climate crisis in the face of industry opposition. And frankly, there are clear gaps between promises and performance of member states, the influence of the fossil fuel industry, COP presidents that are too powerful in agenda setting and too conflicted, and an under-resourced UNFCCC that with an ever-growing list of unfunded mandates. And that forces us to ask, how can we work together to better make COPs, these meetings, fit for purpose? So we are so grateful to our panelists today, who are going to help us examine these issues and topics. Mohamed Adow, who is the founder and director of Power Shift Africa, Mike Davis, the CEO of Global Witness, and Susana Mohamed, the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development for Colombia. So I know we're going to have a very exciting and inspiring conversation. But before I close, I just want to talk a little bit about the future in climate reality. In 2025, we are planning to embark upon a climate ambition tour. We are going to take our movement building trainings to 4 locations. To Europe, to South America, to Africa, and to Asia. And we're really excited about it. We're going to have global and local partners, and we need help from all of you to join us to make sure that we are mounting the best and most impactful trainings. So I hope you'll join us, please, in our Climate Ambition Tour. And before Before I bring the panel, or bring the Vice President up, I just want to ask our branch managers from around the world. Climate Reality has 11 branches. We have thousands and thousands of Climate Reality leaders, trained leaders, and a 3.5 million person network. So I want to ask our branch leaders to stand. You can always tell a branch leader or a Climate Reality leader because we're all wearing these green rings. So if you see folks in any of your meetings or in any of your events that we're wearing green rings, you'll know they're a Climate Reality leader and part of our very powerful network all around the world. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and bring to the stage the world-renowned Climate Reality leader, the most distinguished among the Climate Reality leaders, and the one who leads and guides us in all of our efforts, former U.S. Vice President Al Gore.
Boy, it's great to see you all. I did not expect such a huge crowd. Thank you very much for being here. This is great. And thank you for what you do as part of the Climate Reality Project and what you do in the rest of your lives to move this cause in the right direction. I'm so grateful to see you here. And Phyllis Cutno, thank you for being such a great CEO and president of Climate Reality. It's fantastic. And to the whole Climate Reality team, thank you. And to the distinguished guests and those of you here who are negotiators who've been doing the hard work. One of our board members, Don Henry, is here all the way from Australia. Thank you, Don. Eamon Ryan, Minister of Transport from Ireland, right here. Good to see you, Eamon. We haven't had a chance to visit again yet, but thank you. And I'm looking forward to being on the panel. Is Mohamed Adow here already? Mohamed, thank you. Looking forward to catching up with you in person. Mike Davis with Global Witness. Haven't been put in jail yet. I'm so glad you're here. I shouldn't joke that way because you've still got some more time here, but thank you for pushing hard and doing what you do. We've really benefited from your work. Susana, Mohamed, thank you. It's great to see you again. I love your passion and voice and the way you handle all this, and to everybody else that I probably should be acknowledging, but I haven't done so yet. Thank you very, very much. Well, here we are in Baku, and yet another petro state, but you know, we have to make the best of it. And we're going to win this, and the Climate Reality leaders have been playing such an important role, and I am so grateful to you for everything that you do. This is a challenging COP. Of course, in some ways, they've all been challenging. I was at COP 0 in Rio de Janeiro back in 1992. I was down there in Rio chairing the U.S. Senate delegation to the Earth Summit, is what they called it, when I got the call from then Governor Bill Clinton wanting to know if I'd be interested in being his vice presidential running mate. So there are a lot of reasons I'll always remember that COP. And then there was 2 years of waiting and organizing before COP 1 was organized in Berlin. And you know the rest. I won't go through the history of it. But here we are in the shadow of oil derricks and the shadow of geopolitics as well. And I don't know if you've noticed the oil, what should I call it? Years ago, they called this the Black City. I don't think they call it that anymore. But of course, the history is quite interesting to go through it. And about 90% of their balance of payments is from oil and gas. So it wouldn't be difficult to reach the conclusion that they have a kind of a structural conflict of interest in pushing this COP toward a realization of the commitment made in COP 28 to transition away from fossil fuels. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to see some progress in the remaining days here in spite of that. Of course, they had a big conflict of interest last year with the CEO of one of the dirtiest oil companies on the planet being the president of the COP, and they celebrated. We all pushed hard to get that language requiring a transition away from fossil fuels. But you know, a month after we left Dubai, the largest oil lobby in the U.S., the American Petroleum Institute, started a huge advertising campaign to convince Americans that it was impossible to transition away from fossil fuels. And the head of Saudi Aramco made a famous speech in which he said transitioning away from fossil fuels is a fantasy. Well, he's a nice guy, but he's wrong about that. And I'll tell you what's a fantasy. A fantasy is that they will be able to continue pulling the wool over people's eyes all over the world and fooling us into thinking this is not a problem. We see it every day. It's ridiculous to imagine that people could be fooled into thinking this doesn't have to be solved. It does, of course. And of course, in the wake of the U.S. election, people are naturally coming to grips with what the implications are. And I just want to put a few facts and figures out there, because the person who was elected this time served 4 years before, as you know, and during the first Trump presidency, solar capacity more than doubled, EV sales more than doubled, coal capacity declined by 20%, annual clean energy investment nearly tripled. States were still all in, cities were still all in, businesses and investors and NGOs were all still in and kept the progress going. Because we've now made enough progress that I personally believe this transition, the sustainability transition, is unstoppable. The clean energy is cheaper as well as cleaner. It creates 3 times as many jobs per dollar spent as investing, continuing to invest in dirty energy. And the grassroots movement for climate action is clearly now becoming the largest grassroots movement in the history of the world. As well it should be, because so much is at stake. What we're facing, of course, is a global crisis unlike any we have ever faced. You could say that at the height of the nuclear arms race, we faced a similar magnitude of threat to the future of humanity, and we managed to navigate that so far, at least. But this time, as many of you have heard me say over and over again, it's just startling to look at how thin that blue shell around our planet is, and to realize that that is what we're using as an open sewer for 175 million tons of global warming pollution spewed into it every single day, and the amount continues to go up, and it lingers there, and the concentration now traps as much extra heat as would be released by 750,000 first-generation atomic bombs. I keep reaching for ways to translate these big numbers into a form that I can more easily understand and therefore hopefully more easily communicate to everyone. But I'll tell you who's a much better communicator than I am, and that's Mother Nature. And tragically, we are seeing this continued increase in the number and intensity of the climate-related extreme events. And as I said over in the plenary hall earlier today, I used to use examples of the phenomena that I'm describing here from 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. Now I say this was yesterday, this was last week, this was 2 weeks ago. And when you stop and think about it, those who are here from the United States remember what happened in North Carolina, and also part of my home state of Tennessee, neighboring, and here's a way to quantify the amount of water that was dropped on that region. Western North Carolina was the center of it. when Hurricane Helene came up and dumped that water. They used the number 40 trillion gallons. Well, that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But my team came up with a way that made it easier for me to understand. If you've ever, anybody here ever been to Niagara Falls, the largest falls in North America? Majestic, beautiful sight. Imagine the full flow of Niagara Falls for 619 days. That's how much dropped on North Carolina in just 2 days. Unbelievable. And of course, it's ironic that a lot of people, well, a measurable number of people, I know that a lot of people have moved to Asheville, North Carolina and the surrounding area, partly because they thought it was going to be the area's safest from the future consequences of the climate crisis. We have two beloved staff members of Climate Reality who both lost their homes in and around Asheville because of that catastrophe. Now, 10 days before that deluge hit North Carolina, you wouldn't know it because people don't normally hear the news media connect the dots, but there was a once-in-a-thousand-year rainfall in North Carolina 10 days before Hurricane Helene. So the ground was already saturated. And then less than 2 weeks after Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton came through, and it went west to east instead of south to north and dropped 2 feet of rain on parts of Florida. And it's getting hard to keep up with all these catastrophes. And within 2 days of that North Carolina deluge from Hurricane Helene, there was an almost identical deluge in Kathmandu in Nepal. More than 200 people killed there, the worst flooding they've ever experienced. And then just how many days ago has it been since Valencia got, was that last week? I mean, it hadn't been very long. We saw the temperatures in the Mediterranean go up so high that the water put all that moisture into the sky. You know the story, and that atmospheric river came over Valencia. More than 200 people killed there, thousands of homes destroyed by it. And I've been seeing on the news the massive protests and public outrage in Valencia aimed at the regional government. I'm not adding my voice to that. I don't know the details of what they did and didn't do. But I think people ought to pay attention to it because public officials and others all over the world better prepare themselves for what is coming. Because these kinds of events, the downpours, the droughts, I won't go through the list of the droughts and the fires, but oh my God, you know, New York City was covered with smoke in the last week because of fires in New Jersey and Connecticut and Brooklyn, for goodness sake. But the big fires are in Canada and in the West. And you can go through the list of these catastrophes, and they all add up to just an unacceptably high cost. So this is really something that it obviously has to be addressed. And that's why this grassroots movement for action is so important. Because we have gotten to the point where the development of the alternatives to fossil fuels, and let's be clear, the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis in the main. 80% of all the global warming pollution comes from burning fossil fuels. But now we clearly have something better. And the good news begins with this statistic. If you look at all of the new electricity generation installed worldwide last year, 87% of it was renewable energy. And renewable energy is now a bigger source of electricity than coal, a bigger source than gas. So we're making progress, and the market-driven choices are turning people away from building any new fossil fuel facilities for generating electricity. The renewable energy continues to get cheaper. The EV revolution is really taking hold. You hear about it slowing down over the past year. maybe slightly, but not that much. We're seeing it really go incredibly fast. And the amount of new renewables added worldwide last year increased by 50% in 1 year in 2023, exceeding 500 gigawatts of new energy for the first time. A lot of it in China, by the way. You know, China added more solar capacity in the first 10 months of this year than would be provided by 18 new nuclear power plants built every single month. 18 big nuclear powers, 18 1 gigawatt nuclear power plants. And they doubled their capacity from the previous year. So did the U.S., but from a much smaller base. China exceeded its goals 6 years ahead of time. And now they've asked to be measured differently. Instead of on the reduction in energy intensity, they are now being asked to be measured on the amount of their emissions. That's a good sign, because they've now built up so much capacity, they can start turning off those coal plants they've been building, tragically, much more often. They've been operating at 50% capacity because the droughts have cut back on their hydroelectric power, and they've faced a lot of nervousness from regional governments that there might be unemployment if their factories run out of electricity. So they built these standby coal plants, and you might say they're kind of coal peaker plants, which is ridiculous, but they've got the power and the money to do it, so they have. But now they're poised to make a big shift, and in the years ahead, watch for China to claim global leadership in accelerating this shift. And all of a sudden, the West is vulnerable to being characterized as the bad guys in this. But you know, we've got to recognize that the solution for this crisis is well in hand. We've got the technologies. You know, the IEA said we've got everything we need for 50% reductions and a clear line of sight to the remaining 50%. But here's the twist in this. Most all of the new renewable energy is being built in the rich countries. And I'm glad we're building more energy, solar and wind there. But 100% of the increased emissions in the years going forward will come from the developing countries. 100%. So we need to continue deploying it in the rich countries, but we need to deploy it in the developing countries as well. And as some of you may have heard me say, it is a disgrace under the conditions we're now facing that the entire continent of Africa has fewer solar panels installed than the single U.S. state of Florida. And Florida is not the most not the heaviest user of solar energy. Probably should be with all the sun they have, but it's not. It's lagged behind because of political leadership and the power of the electric utilities that don't want it. They've slowed it down. But the fact that one U.S. state has more solar panels than the entire continent of Africa, when Africa has 60% of the global potential for solar and 400 times as much solar capacity as all of the fossil fuel reserves that are in Africa. And by the way, the reason for it is that when you look at how these solar and wind and batteries and EVs facilities are being financed, 85% of the money comes from the private sector. That's how most development takes place in this world. But access to private capital in developing countries is not only unequal, many of them are basically walled off from access to private capital. In Nigeria, they can often be charged interest rates that are 7 times higher than what is paid in the U.S. or the EU. But that's where we need to really be focusing the building of much more clean energy so that we can shut down this fossil fuel jihad. The fossil fuel companies are rushing into Africa. They call it a gas rush. We'll talk about that on this panel a little bit. But if you look at all the infrastructure that is being built and proposed in Africa for gas pipelines, oil pipelines, refineries, LNG terminals, new coal mines. They're planning many new coal mines and oil wells. It's crazy But of course, the fossil fuel companies benefit, and they don't have the same difficulty in getting access to financing that the renewable energy companies and investors have. So we've got to change this, and that means the World Bank and the IMF, and I won't take the time to go into that in detail here, but it's just wrong that the fossil fuel industry has gained so much control over the world's processes for trying to solve this climate crisis. It's not unique to them, you know, because we've seen the role of money in politics get to such an unhealthy degree. We have in the U.S. minoritarian government on many issues, like guns, for example. The vast majority in both political parties want to ban assault weapons and restrict access to some of these guns that are used in the mass shootings. But the gun manufacturers have gained so much control over the politics of guns that they're able to block what the majority want to do. And you can go down a long list of issues where the same thing is true. We have to break through. And the way to break through is with grassroots advocacy and action. And that's what you're doing, and that's another reason why I'm so grateful to all of you for working as hard as you do. And of course, the oil and gas companies are trying to fool us into thinking that they can just, you know, continue emitting all this pollution into the sky as long as they want to, because they'll just suck it out of the air afterwards. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, you know, that's like, I have a bridge I'll say if you believe that, but if you look at the carbon capture and sequestration, it is a fraud. It's an absolute fraud. And they know it's a fraud, but they continue putting it out there, and with some of the right-wing media and some of the outlets that will do whatever the fossil fuel industry wants them to do, they try to continue fooling people into thinking that's going to be the solution to it. It's not, of course. And we have to penetrate that veil of illusion and have policies that are based on the truth of our situation. Now, the media environment is also an issue here, by the way. You know, it is wrong, and it's wrong to compare anything to the Third Reich, and I don't intend to do so in talking about some of the political movements in the U.S. I really do not. But I want to make reference anyway to a sentence that really captured my attention when I read it. A man named Theodor Adorno, and I want to set the background briefly. During World War II and before, some philosophers escaped to Germany and waited out the war in a safe country. And after the war, they went back to Germany, and they founded what's called the Frankfurt School of Philosophy. And the most famous member of that was a man named Jürgen Habermas. But one of his colleagues, Theodor Adorno, conducted essentially a moral autopsy of the Third Reich. And he identified what he said was the first step on the descent to hell. And he said the first step was this: all questions of truth became questions of power. The whole basis of self-government, the whole basis of liberal democracy, the whole basis of the system by which free peoples govern themselves is based on our ability to have a deep, thorough discussion with one another to approach collective decision-making by identifying what's more likely to be true than not, and then basing our policies on what we together determine are the best available facts, and then trying to find our way forward. But if the basic flow of information is twisted and distorted by some of the nature of the new media, you know, these algorithms on the websites, for example, you've heard the word rabbit holes. They're sort of like pitcher plants, if you know what they are. The sides are slippery. And when people click on something and they like it, the algorithms, oh, you like that? I got some more of that. And what variety would you like? And pretty soon they're slipping down that rabbit hole, And you know what's at the bottom of the rabbit hole? That's where the echo chamber is. And people who spend long enough in the echo chamber become highly vulnerable to a new form of AI. Not artificial intelligence, artificial insanity. And I'm not joking with that phrase. That's where QAnon comes from. That's where election denial and climate denial come from. We have to return to a form of collective decision-making that is based in a determined way on the search for truthfulness and the collective discourse that will allow us together to find the best way forward. Now, finally, this process of where the COPs are chosen and how they're conducted, Phyllis and I and Climate Reality have advocated a reform in the COP process, and of course it's hard to do. But 3 years in a row in a petrostate, obviously it needs to be reformed. And all of the fossil fuel participants, Mike, you've been the leader in identifying one by one all of these fossil fuel participants who are in these COPs, and it's grown and grown and grown, and we first noticed it clearly in Glasgow, and it's gotten worse since then. Why should the fossil fuel industry have more delegates than the combined delegations for the 10 most impacted countries by the climate crisis? I believe that, first of all, I think that the Secretary General ought to have a role in picking where these COPs are based and not just let Russia veto everybody except Azerbaijan this time around and rotate it between these regions and in a kind of in a fashion that lets the industry manipulate it as effectively as they have. But I also think that we ought to have a standard set of criteria governing who from the fossil fuel industry should be allowed to be a delegate to these COPs. Here's what I think the criteria ought to be. Number one, do they have a real and credible net zero commitment in the company they're from? If not, no. Do they have a plan to phase down the production of oil and gas? Are they committed to full disclosure of their global warming pollution emissions? Are they spending an adequate share of their windfall profits on the transition to clean energy? Will they end their anti-climate lobbying? Will they end their greenwashing? If they can't pass that test, they ought not be allowed to participate as delegates in these COPs, because that proves they're not here to help. So I think we ought to push this reform agenda. I see from the reminder timer here that I'm running out of time, and we've got a great panel, but I would just close by saying we have got to move faster and be bolder. I had the privilege of becoming friends with the late Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, and got to know him in Russia. He wrote some beautiful poems, and one of them was called Half Measures. And it was based on a central metaphor about a man trying to leap from one edge of a chasm to the other. And the simple point the poem made was, don't try to do it in 2 leaps, because you'll fall in the middle. And we have got to make it all the way across as quickly as possible. And we can do it. As Nelson Mandela famously said, it always seems impossible until it is done. Well, that's our job before us. And I'll close where I began. I have more gratitude in my heart for all of you and for your colleagues who are climate leaders all over the world than I can possibly put into words. When I first became knowledgeable of this 55 years ago, I never imagined it would take over my life. But as some of you have learned, this is a kind of challenge. When you pick it up, you can't put it down. Ask Alden Meyer sitting back there. He can't put it down. I'm not sure you've even tried, Alden. And I heard a great quote from Alden. I read it today when he said, COPs are mirrors. Each COP is a mirror into which humanity looks. And if it's an ugly image, it's not the fault of the mirror. It's up to us to change what we're doing wrong and to change what we have been failing to do and to really gear up to do it properly. So thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to this panel. We've got a lot of work to do. Let's get it done. Thank you very much. Mohamed Adow of PowerShift Africa, Mike Davis, CEO of Global Witness, Susana Mohamed, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia. Now it's working. Hi, nice to see you again. Gracias. Gracias a usted. Hey, Mike, thank you very much. Thank you. I'm glad you made it here, man. I don't want to spend much time dwelling on, he was accused of a hybrid attack when he talked, well, I've already violated my rule of not talking about it too much, but hybrid attack sounds like a Russian phrase for hybrid warfare. But anyway, okay, I want to continue our discussion now, or start our discussion with all three of you, and thank you very much. I've introduced our panelists, and Mohamed is founder and director of PowerShift Africa, was very helpful to us in our training last year in West Africa, in Ghana, and a satellite location in Lagos, and it was a very successful training, and we really appreciate your help. And Susana Mohamed, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia, not your garden variety minister. She has really incisive analyses and bold ideas. I really like the way you express yourself and the policies you're pursuing, Susana. Thank you very much. And Mike, I've already said, we started highlighting the outsized and unhealthy role of the fossil fuel industry in these negotiations, partly because Mike was assiduously collecting the data. So let's see. Mohamed, I want to start with you. The climate crisis demands that leaders step up and not step back. You've been doing that. I want to hear your thoughts on what you think we all can do to make sure that countries and cities continue to push forward progress and don't backtrack. I should say, by the way, before I turn it over to you, that applies to my country as well, because in the wake of the Trump re-election, I already told you what happened during his first term, but something else has happened since then. The investments in renewable energy and batteries, et cetera, in the U.S. have changed the political facts on the ground in many, many states. It's going to be very difficult to turn back a lot of the provisions of the IRA, even if they want to. But in any case, what can we do to avoid stepping back and continue to push forward? What would you recommend?
Thanks so much, Vice President Gore. I think we have an excellent opportunity to make some real progress. If we truly internalize the risk we're facing, there's an opportunity for us to develop a forward-looking plan that allows us to develop in a climate-compatible manner. The way climate has been framed in the past, it's that it's some burden that you need to avoid. That being asked to help accelerate climate action requires of you to compromise on your well-being, on your prosperity. And I think we've realized and seen in many parts of the world that that is actually a losing game. So there's an opportunity for us to reframe climate action and frame it around the opportunity to enhance well-being and our shared prosperity. And the only way you can deliver that is through multilateral action. What makes Paris Agreement, what made Paris actually successful was the idea of getting every country to participate. Unlike Kyoto, which targeted only the industrialized countries, Paris was actually good because it asked of both the large and the small countries, rich and poor countries, those in the global north and those in the global south, to contribute to the global effort to tackle climate change. And that allowed us to be able to harvest the greatest contribution from the world. What we haven't done well at is how to make that effort, that contribution fair, so that those with the broadest shoulders, with the greatest financial and technological wherewithal, do more of what is needed to help safeguard the planet. So I think there is an opportunity here, and I come from Nairobi, Kenya, in the continent of Africa. Majority of our population lacks electricity. 600 million Africans don't have electricity. Close to 1 billion Africans don't have access to clean cooking. But that continent is incredibly blessed with renewable energy. In fact, 60% of the solar potential is in Africa. 40% of the green minerals that are needed for decarbonization are in Africa. So there's an opportunity for us to actually help carve a future that makes that continent that is energy poor, that is climate vulnerable, to become a green leader and leapfrog to a future where those of us who've missed out on the fossil fuel-powered industrialization can actually help lead in the green revolution. Now, if you paint it in those terms, it's the thing that mobilizes our young people. You know, majority of our population is actually, 70% of Africans are young. And so that future can actually be delivered best if we do it through the accelerated deployment of renewables, if we do it by exploiting the potential of the arable land that is available. And so what I will say is, let's cease framing climate as a burden. Let's reframe it as an opportunity so that we are all there to win together. And that is the opportunity we have that makes us winners, not losers.
Fantastic, thank you, and we'll come back to you for more. Susana, Minister Mohamed, I want to ask you about the NDCs, but before I do, I want to note for this audience and acknowledge that you just led the UN Biodiversity COP16 in Cali, Colombia. Congratulations on your leadership. And I want to... And I want to ask you to share with this group of climate leaders what was the most significant outcome from COP16 and the biodiversity process, in your opinion. And when it comes to NDCs, based on what you've learned additionally from the biodiversity process, what role should they play in addressing the gap for action on climate that still exists? But first, tell us what you think was most significant about COP16.
Well, we had 3 political objectives as the host government, and I greet you and all of you, and thank you for the invitation. So we had 3 political objectives as the host government, and those objectives were the ones that made us proud. And then we had the negotiation objectives of the negotiation itself, which is the multilateral process. So we decided that we wanted to make that COP People's COP. And that meant that there was going to be a mobilization of the grassroots towards the COP in a way that influenced the environment of negotiation. And we also took this COP very fast. Actually, it was Turkey that was supposed to host it. And so 8 months before, Colombia stepped up because Turkey couldn't organize it for some internal reasons.
That's all the time you had?
Yes.
Wow.
So we had to organize from scratch. But we decided the first measure was that it was going to be People's COP. And then the second one is that we wanted to inspire people to make peace with nature, like more a deeper call on something that is meaningful and that you can relate to. And that motto, making peace with nature, really made a mobilization that was historic for a biodiversity COP. We tripled the presence of the private sector. In Montreal, we have like 1,000 representatives from the private sector. In COP16 in Cali, we had 3,000. We mobilized 500,000 people through 1 million people through the green zone from a diversity of systems of knowledge, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant communities, peasants, activists from young people, but from the neighborhoods, not your usual black suit and tie COP, but actually the grassroots. And for us, that was very important because it created a sense of hope because everybody could participate and could access. We had, since we launched that this was going to be People's COP, the request from people to prepare. We hosted 140 pre-COPs, organizing and educating people to be able to be part of COP16 in a meaningful way. And they came so prepared. And so that mobilization, that diversity of humanity gathering there, the culture that was expressed, actually I think mobilized also the negotiation results. I had some delegates saying that is the first COP they enjoy, actually, that the spirit was joy. And that then we were able to achieve a historic decision on creating a subsidiary body for indigenous peoples and local communities that will be permanent in the CDB process. So actually, it also became real, this issue that it was People's COP. Now the people had a place that is not through the states, but direct influence on the process. And also, I think on the other hand, we were able to mobilize the private sector so that they accepted that if they use the digital sequencing of genetic resources in databases, they should pay for that. So it was created a fund, the Cali Fund, to receive the contributions of the private sector when they use these databases, and that will be public funding for funding biodiversity. So I think it was a very important issue. And finally, we were able to organize that Afro-descendants, which is a very interesting category in many places. People that are from African descent but are caring for biodiversity were recognized. Where do we got tangled, which is the same like here, in the finance decision. So it was a mixture of feelings at the last plenary, but we're going to have the second round. We're going to have another plenary, and we're going to pass the financial decisions, and we're going to be able to show that we can advance through multilateral processes, and this is not totally a failure. But what is adding to what you were saying is that if the grassroots are mobilized and inspired, I think that's where hope and change can really happen.
Well, thank you, and congratulations again. A great, great job. So I'm going to come to you, Mike, but before I do, I want to ask both Susana and Mohamed, if I may call you Susana. What makes for a good NDC for a developing country that doesn't have a giant amount of emissions now? How should that be approached? Both of you.
So this is a good thing. Majority of the world doesn't have any fossil holding. So if you think about the continent of Africa, you only have fossil in half a dozen countries. The rest of the continent is incredibly blessed with renewables. Now, an NDC is a country's climate plan. But because of how it was framed at the beginning as a mitigation burden that the rich historic polluter wanted to shift to the developing countries, countries haven't internalized the opportunity to frame them as an investment vehicle that allows you to tap into the resources that are available to allow you to develop in a climate compatible way. Now, I'll take the example of Africa. It's possible to accelerate the deployment of renewable and for Africa to become the first renewable energy superpower. But that opportunity can only be realized if we help our countries rethink how they view NDCs. Last year in Dubai, we had an important decision to phase out fossil fuels, to triple renewables, and to double energy efficiency. Now, when it comes to Africa, we already have about 60 gigawatts of renewable energy installed in the continent. And in last year's Africa Climate Summit that was held in Nairobi, the continent of Africa committed to double the total installed electricity capacity exclusively from renewables. Now, that is in the Nairobi Declaration. How many of the countries are included in the NDC in a way that they can actually take national responsibility for their share of the increase in renewables? And so if we approach the NDC in a way that sits well with the development planning of a country, I think we can harvest the greatest potential for climate ambition. And that is the opportunity we have with the next set of NDCs. There's an opportunity for us to actually encourage countries to include the energy transition in their plan. The country that I come from is currently powered by largely renewable energy. 92% of our electricity is from renewables. And Kenya has a plan to be powered by renewables at 100% by 2030. Now, the challenge those of us from that country have is to hold the government accountable to include that in the NDC so that they can be able to make a case for climate financing that helps them to meet that ambition. So that's the first part on the mitigation ambition, if I may call it so. The second part that we've actually overlooked, and I think it's something we've neglected, is adaptation planning. We're now only at 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And we can all see the impact of climate change. We're planning to hold warming to below 1.5 degrees. So you can imagine the scale of impact from 1.2 to 1.5. But if you look at the science, and we saw the WMO report, we're on a pathway to 2.7 degrees. So how about developing forward-looking plans that integrate climate risk and uncertainties so that we can be able to build our collective resilience? The way NDCs have been approached is you only think of NDCs in terms of mitigation. If you're on the front line, suffering fast and worst the impact of climate change, and you've contributed very little, then the first overriding priority you have is your safety of your life, of your livelihoods, of your society. And so we need to find in ourselves to elevate adaptation and drive a conversation that allows us to take climate impact seriously so that we can be able to future-proof our future development. And I think there's an opportunity there that will allow the whole world to join in this global effort on climate change on terms that allows us to deliver the greatest ambition. Third and final thing is finance. We're now negotiating in a climate COP, climate finance. How about having a needs-based climate finance target where every country in their NDC are able to cost the actions that they're putting forward so that they can separate the unconditional contribution they're making using their own national resources and the part that they expect the international community to finance. Now, if each country, particularly in the global majority, in their NDCs were to define the scale of resources they require for mitigation, for adaptation, and for loss and damage, you could easily add up the aggregate finance requirement and have a process that isn't subject to the political whims of the current leaders who don't take our future seriously, but you will have determined the total needs of the world. So those three things are critical, but those three things will not secure our future. The things that have been bad at is their deadlines. If it's phase out of fossil fuels, it's the acceleration of renewables. If it's the development of adaptation plans, they put good plans without including stricter timelines. So if we can have a package that includes those four components, I think we can safely say we will be able to tackle climate change and have everybody joining in the effort in a way that we feel we're collectively working to secure our future.
Well, thank you very much. And Susana, same question, then I'm going to go to you, Mike. What makes for a good NDC for a developing country?
For us, we have seen it that we really face the challenge of climate change. And in a country like Colombia, facing that challenge means understanding that as a coal exporter and oil exporter, if we don't shift our whole economy, in 15 years, our markets will be closed and the impact that that will have on fiscal income of the government and macroeconomic stability is huge. And we have to make a transition that is unprecedented in terms of economics, that what takes decades to build needs to be built in less than two decades. We don't have right now the resources to do so. We are highly indebted, and the access to capital, as you mentioned, is 10% compared to the developed world that is 1%. So when we put these figures and we talk about an NDC, we don't want to continue doing academic exercises of how you're going to bring down emissions, where is the projects of adaptation. You have to face the reality. How much is costing the climate impact every year? We've been 2 years in government, and at least it has been $400 million per year in climate impacts that were not budgeted in the national budget. We have to face that we have to create at least 4 economic sectors that will replace the export of oil and gas, or in the current financial regime, the consequence will be that we will have to continue drilling, even if we are committed to the transition. And the NDC has also to establish what are the territorial changes that are needed with the people. This has to have blood, sweat, tears, the people on the ground, the territories. What is the future of those territories, and what is going to happen? What are the adaptation measures? But the adaptation window is closing very fast. It is a lot about loss and damage, and it's a lot about making citizens realize that their current reality is not going to be their climate reality next. So what are we going to do? Facing climate. That's what the NDC should do. And then I agree very much with Mohamed that should have a financial plan which clearly states how much public investment you need to address the challenge, how much other bankable projects you can have. You have to have a portfolio of investment, but that is clear on the transition. And so far, we are not at that level of discussion. So that's why emissions continue growing, fossil fuel production continues growing. Of course, is the system how it is, but also so many countries depend on their fiscal stability and the macroeconomic stability of this oil and gas and coal. And if there's not an alternative, nobody will put their economy at risk. Who's going to put it first? So the Colombian NDC wants to put that challenge. We are even discussing, and it's going to be a hard discussion. I don't know if we're going to survive government putting that discussion forward, which is, are we going to put no proliferation of fossil fuels in our NDC as an oil company? We already committed not to sign more exploration contracts. We're still having exploration. We're still giving licenses. But how do you stop the proliferation of fossil fuel, but then how do you replace the income? And it has to be very realistic. And we hope to have that discussion in the process of the NDC development.
Well, thank you. Very, very well said. And I want to shift now to the influence of the fossil fuel industry. And Mike, you have done a terrific job with your organization, Global Witness, in tracking the efforts of the fossil fuel companies to infiltrate, dominate, capture, and influence this COP process. Of course, it goes all the way back. I mentioned COP 0 in Rio de Janeiro. That is where the famous oil and coal lobbyist named Don Perlman, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but in those years he worked closely with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and Alden and I were talking about this again the other day. I found out, you probably know this, there's actually a play in London about this whole thing. I need to go see that play. Did you know that? No, I didn't. Mohamed said he's up on everything like this. I just found out. But there's a play about his dominance of the process, and he cooperated with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to really establish the rules that led us to this situation today, because most UN processes, they have the ability to have a supermajority vote so that they don't give every one of the 194 nations in the world a veto power over what the world can decide, how could you ever get anything done that way? Well, that's part of what we're struggling with now. We have to do it anyway, but that was his doing, because when they got to that part of the negotiation, he worked with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to object to the adoption of the rules of procedure, and so the default rule was consensus. And that's by design, the fossil fuel industry design. That has hamstrung this process in all of these years since, 32 years now, since the Rio Earth Summit. And that is another reform that needs to be implemented. It may be hard to do, I get it, but we've got to try to reform that as well. But now bring us up to the present. When did this, I already said it started with the COP0, the first one, but when did it get so out of control? And what do you have to say about it? What can we do about it?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me, first
Yep.
of all? Yeah.
Hold it close.
Yeah. No, thanks very much for hosting me. It's a real honor to be here with you and the Minister and Mohamed as well. I mean, we've actually been investigating the corrupting influence of the oil and gas industry for about 25 years. I think you've put your finger on, if you like, the original sin in terms of the COP processes. And we've been stepping up our investigations into this as regards COP over the past 3-4 years. And there's two learnings for us in particular that stand out. One is that actually the fossil fuel industry is really quite fearful of the potential of COP to generate momentum for a phase out and the end of their business. Their response to that is to flood these summits as best they can with lobbyists whose sole task is to stop that from happening. And we have been tracking that over recent years, and since Monday, Tuesday this week, we've had a team which, using a combination of AI methods and the sort of, if you like, the artisanal manual checking, have been deciphering that list, sort of 52,000 odd delegates, to figure out who's really who. And yeah, we released those figures this morning with our coalition partners, the Kick Big Polluters Out coalition. We've identified 1,773 fossil fuel lobbyists here this time. As you said earlier, Mr. Gore, that is more than the combined delegations of the 10 countries which are most impacted by climate breakdown. And if the fossil fuels lobby was a country, it would be the 4th best represented here in Baku.
Wow. And they're not here. You made this point, but excuse me for interrupting.
Yeah.
They're not here to help. They're not here to be a part of a collective effort to solve this crisis. They're here to block any action.
They're here to block any action, and they are, in a way, surfing one of the foundational myths of the lobbying effort, which you just traced the origins of, which is the idea that we actually need the fossil fuels industry to help us get out of this appalling mess that they've created for us. And we need collectively to break through that, because it is really holding us back. I would also say that, first of all, we think that these fossil fuel lobbyists should be barred from the COP summits. But also that there's a second observation that we have from our investigations over the past couple of years, which is the way in which, unbelievably cynical though it may be, we're seeing authoritarian petrostates actually using the hosting of COP, and you alluded to this earlier, as a shop window, a kind of showroom for oil and gas deals. And what really struck us after the COP in Dubai last year was when we did an analysis of the deal-making efforts of ADNOC, whose head you referred
Abu
to
Dhabi
earlier.
National Oil Company.
Yeah. They actually sought, during the year that they had the COP presidency, deals worth around about $100 billion. And we were quite struck by that. We thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if Azerbaijan will try to follow the same playbook. So we had this hypothesis, and we decided to test it out. So we created our own oil and gas investment company, and we approached the COP presidency introducing ourselves as investors who were interested in sponsoring COP29 here in Baku, but also interested in oil and gas deals. And we were quite surprised by how quickly we got through to the CEO of the COP presidency team. This is a gentleman named Elnur Sultanov. And we got into conversation with him, and he was very keen and very helpful in terms of proposing that when we came to COP with our investors hat on, that we could be introduced to senior executives from SOCAR, which is the Azerbaijan National Oil and Gas Company, and potentially do deals with them here in Baku during the summit. Mr. Sultanov also memorably observed that fossil fuel production would continue possibly forever, I think were his words. And this really goes to the heart of one of the main obstacles we think facing the success of summits like this. We don't think that autocratic petrostates should be allowed to host COP summits, and there's a reason for that which pertains to the reputation laundering as much as the deal making. And I'd like to mention momentarily what happens to people from Azerbaijan who raise questions about the way in which their government uses natural resources here. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Gubad Ibadoglu. He is an academic at the London School of Economics, and over many years he's been quite outspoken in his writings about the problem of corruption in the oil and gas business in Azerbaijan. When he visited last year, he was arrested, he was beaten up, was put in jail, is now under house arrest and subject to a range of spurious legal charges. As of now, he's still under house arrest. There's no date for his trial. We believe that he should be released immediately and all the charges dropped. And we think this underscores the problem of having COPs hosted in places like Azerbaijan. The last point I'd like to make is this is not just our view, and some of you may have seen an open letter released this morning by various international climate leaders, including Ban Ki-moon, Mary Robinson, Christiana Figueres, which calls very persuasively and powerfully for reform of the COP process. It cites both our undercover investigation, which exposed the attempt at deal-making by the COP presidency here, and also the proliferation of fossil fuel lobbyists here. And it calls very clearly for an end to the practice of allowing autocratic petrostates to host COP, and it also calls for much tighter rules on the presence of industry lobbyists.
Well, thank you for the work that you've been doing. And I have to say, on a personal note, that it takes no small amount of courage for you to show up in this country after they kind of made, I don't know, would you call it an implicit threat when they accused you of a hybrid attack? Did you worry about coming?
Yeah, we thought about it quite hard. I mean, there's an additional sort of twist, a sort of puzzle is to sort of figure out what a hybrid attack is. And once we get to the bottom of that, we'll probably have a clearer sense of just what we're accused of. We're also accused of being representatives of special services as well, which is also quite a new term for me. But anyway, it doesn't sound very friendly. So
no,
yeah.
It doesn't. And my interpretation of it is that I don't think I'm particularly clever in this, but I remember, Vladimir Putin and the Russians often use the phrase hybrid warfare, and we in the United States have been the object of information warfare by Russia, Iran, etc. And in modern military theory, hybrid warfare is very much what these nations think about. And the information warfare component of it is where the hybrid comes from. At least that's my understanding of it. And I think maybe when they say that you were part of special services, that's another indication that they were trying to imply that you were attacking them as part of an organized, broader effort to undermine them in a hybrid information warfare attack. You're just trying to get the truth out, for God's sake, and try to get a good cop. I propose this list of reforms here, give the Secretary General a role in picking the host nation and the presidency of the COP. By the way, the Secretary General doesn't really want that. I love this Secretary General, by the way. This is not any kind of criticism of him. I think he's fantastic, Antonio Guterres. I really love the guy. But he doesn't want this because I think it would make his job a lot harder. But what else are we going to do? I think he ought to have a role. I think the voting procedure ought to be reformed, and I think that there ought to be a list of these criteria that I went through in my opening remarks. Do you agree that that would be a good start, or do you have another set of proposals?
I think it would be a great start, and yeah, I would again draw attention to this letter which was released this morning by these climate leaders, which sets out 7 recommendations, and they seem to me like a pretty persuasive agenda which perhaps all of us could get behind in terms of COP reform, because it talks about, the fossil fuel lobbyists, the problem of autocratic petrostates hosting COP, but it also talks about some of the points that my fellow panel members have already referred to in terms of, for instance, robust tracking of climate financing, recognizing the links between poverty, inequity, planetary instability, the need for much tighter monitoring and follow-up in terms of the implementation and accountability for states which are part of COP, as well as the need for the streamlining of the process. So, I mean, this is fresh for me too, but I would strongly encourage everybody to take a look at it. I mean, these are figures of real international stature, and perhaps there is a basis for building this into a wider international campaign that we could all get behind.
Well, anything that Mary Robinson and Christina Figueres are involved in, I'm going to pay real careful attention to it. I thought it was hilarious when Sultan Al-Jaber tried to mansplain to Mary Robinson the climate issues last year. But this is a question for all 3 of you. There are climate leaders here from many countries around the world. How can we be effective in urging our respective nations to support reform in the COP process? Any ideas?
First thing first, I think we just need to acknowledge that this process is very slow and frustrating. That's the first thing, and that's why we need to think about what we need to do to strengthen. The word I choose is actually what we need to do to strengthen, because multilateralism is the foundation of climate action. In wanting to reform, we wouldn't want to ditch away the consensus-building approach that we have, but look at how we strengthen it. When it comes to hosting COPs, I think the criteria you said is excellent, but you need to remember that this is done by rotation from one UN region to the other. One of the reasons why we keep ending with some of these bad precedents is because the climate progressives, I'll take the example of Africa during COP27, can't afford to host a COP. Now, if those who have greater financial capacity don't support the progressives to actually come forward to host it, the opportunity to actually have the COP in a good country that follows the science, that wants to lead this process in an impartial manner will not be realized. So we need to be careful, because we have close to 200 countries and we don't want any carbon leakage. This is a challenge. You can't allow any country to free ride. At the end of the day, you want every country to contribute, a fair share effort to tackle climate change. Now, before we get to that point, we just need to recognize this one was Eastern Europe. This is a country that came forward. There were other countries that could come forward, but there's no diplomacy to encourage and support other countries to step up. We'll go to Brazil, another country that produces oil and gas, so you can't shy away from that fact.
But with a president who is
committed.
Yeah.
But now the advocacy towards Brazil has to help us win the battle around fossil fuel phase out by ending expansion of fossil fuels. So you can't just offer as a progressive without coming forward to agree to the non-proliferation of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, you aren't any different from Azerbaijan or from UAE.
Yep.
After that, the next one after that has put itself forward is Australia. If we don't...
well, we hope.
Yeah.
Turkey is...
Turkey is a candidate, and now, through this effort, we need to do everything to help avoid it. I don't think we can shy away recognizing the challenge a Turkish presidency is going to pose.
Yeah.
What we haven't had, those of us that actively intervene in this space to help enhance ambition, to carefully orchestrate the choice of the COP presidency. And now, that function is as important as the effort that we put into the COP process itself. And so there's an opportunity here for us to recognize these spaces are venues for organizing. We shouldn't be coming to a COP to agonize about how bad things are going. So what can we do to help accelerate ambition before a COP president is chosen? By actively encouraging the good ones to step up, but also facilitating and enabling them with the resources to allow them to put their name forward. If you don't do that hard work before, you'll end up with a Turkish presidency. And that is something we can't afford. And so this active intervention by the good, like-minded countries to help us avoid bad presidencies is something we should be truly invested in.
Yeah, I've heard of good cops and bad cops. Maybe it has a new meaning, that phrase. Yeah, but Susana?
I think there is a dissonance in between the scale of the crisis and challenge we're facing and the discussions at COP.
Absolutely.
I mean, for me...
Dissonance, yeah.
Dissonance, but total dissonance. It takes days, months to discuss a procedure. So many talented people that are not coming together to work on decisions that have political sense, but actually on procedures and technocracy. It has become a very enclosed technocracy. The first time as a minister that the negotiating team, when we were preparing for the Egypt COP, sat with me and explained what they were going to negotiate, the first thing I said to them is, speak in Spanish, please. Speak in Spanish means they talk in acronyms that common people can't understand. I was telling them, you cannot speak in acronyms, you have to speak in complete words for everything you say, and you have to explain why are we having these discussions. And when we made the map of discussions, I said, this doesn't make any sense. And also the geopolitics in COP, sometimes it's not even the real geopolitics. It becomes in between the negotiators who actually spend maybe a decade negotiating. They become very good friends with each other, and they become in a closed world, totally sometimes out of the reality of what's happening. COPs need to have people at the center, have to throw the walls out. It needs to be democratic. It needs to infuse. Now it's all enclosed walls, and you don't see, everything is so controlled. I don't know. And then the discussions don't make any sense. When I am as a minister, I'm participating in this process, and I have to talk to the press. Sometimes I mean, we make our parallel agenda because I don't find that it has meaning, the discussions that we're having at COPs. The process, and that makes the process very slow, tedious, and it doesn't say anything to real people that are facing the crisis. So, for example, at COPs, we are the first oil producer country that has joined an initiative to call for a non-proliferation of fossil fuel treaty. And we are working hard. But I tell you, it's been 1 year trying to bring in more countries. We are 14 countries. And it has not been easy. Because there are many questions. In reality, what are the consequences of non-proliferation? How do you put the multilateral process, a meaningful economic pact, a multilateral process, to non-proliferate? How do you put the elephant in the room, which is that the economic consequences of getting out of oil? They are not discussed at length. COP is not dealing with that. COP is dealing with the emissions, which is just the consequence, the tip of the iceberg, but it's not going to the root causes that require the transformation. And it has become actually a disempowering process rather than an empowering process. And I think that fundamentally needs to change.
Thank you very much. Mike, you want to address this? How can we be most effective in encouraging our countries to support reform?
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what's already been said with more authority than I could bring to this by the Minister and by Mohamed. But I would like perhaps to slightly amplify a couple of points which they've made and you've made. I think one is the need for openness around COP, I mean, these gatherings, but the wider process. And I think that's why people do have genuine concerns about not just the fact that we have this COP here in Azerbaijan, but the sequential quality that you referred to earlier. It's 3 in a row. One of our concerns and our colleagues and peers in civil society is that this is really normalizing this becoming a very closed, exclusive space, which people actually don't really feel safe in, and quite a lot of people don't come as a result. It's the antithesis of what the minister was talking about in terms of the Cali COP16, making that a people's COP. I also just wanted to amplify what's already been put very eloquently, which I think is the issue of communication. Part of the inclusivity here is this bizarre vernacular which COP has. I mean, the acronyms, the lumpy language, much of this, of course, is in English. I'm a native English speaker, but even I struggle with it. And then we all, in our respective roles, whether you're the Minister for Environment, whether you're a climate thought leader in Africa, whether you're somebody working for an NGO in the UK, it's an immense challenge of how you actually sort of bring this out and make it feel to people like it means something to their lives. Mohamed used the word opportunity a lot. How do we extract from this language the sense that there's an opportunity and a meaning in terms of people's prosperity and well-being and something positive? So I'll leave it there, but I feel that that's not the main thing, but it's a kind of aggravating factor on top of the sort of the closure of the space.
Yeah, well, thank you. So today is Energy Day at COP29. Woo! And while we have made great progress in our transition to clean energy, I have not heard any discussion of the pledge to transition away from fossil fuels at this COP. In fact, I'm not sure I've even heard the phrase fossil fuels very much, except that they're a gift from God in the opening speech. And I understand why he says that, of course. But last year, countries agreed, in addition to the transition away language, which turned out, unfortunately, not to have any follow-through yet. Maybe we will eventually. But in addition to that, countries agreed to triple renewable energy by 2030. That is not as outlandish a goal as one might think because the markets are moving so quickly, but it's still a stretch goal for sure. And a tripling of renewable energy in 6 years is difficult. The IEA, International Energy Agency, I'm going to take your advice and not use these acronyms. Thank you, Susana. The International Energy Agency recently reported that there's been great progress, but that much more needs to be done if we're going to reach that goal. And as I said, the goal has to be emphasized in the developing countries. Mohamed, what needs to happen in your view to speed the transition to clean energy? What are the obstacles and how can we ensure more effectively that the global south is not left behind?
I think first thing first, it's very infuriating that the potential of renewables remains untapped across the world. If you look at the continent of Africa, that is a continent that has, the greatest potential of renewables, abundant sunshine, if I just take one example. But in 2022, the rainy country called Belgium installed more solar panels than the whole of Africa. Belgium, tiny, rainy, installed more solar panels than the whole of Africa.
Wow.
And you're talking about a continent that has 60% of the solar potential of the world.
And 400 times as much as the potential from all the fossil fuel, and virtually every country in Africa could fill 100, I'm sorry to interrupt you, I got to get this out there. Virtually every country in Africa could supply 100% of its electricity needs with less than 0.1% of its land territory.
Exactly, just 0.1%. And another example is this. Japan has 41 times more solar panels than Egypt. 41 times more than Egypt. And one solar panel in Egypt will produce 64% more solar power than a solar panel in Japan.
That's a great stat.
Now, why is that happening? It's because we're not investing in the solutions. At the beginning, this is other historic scene from '92. We were made to focus on emissions reductions, that carbon dioxide molecule. No one looked at the elephant in the room, which was fossil fuels, and the opportunity to avoid fossil fuels and accelerate the transition to renewables. Imagine if from '92, we started seeing fossil fuels for what they are and help the world accelerate the transition, what that will do to the world. And we're still fixated, even when we think of the nationally determined contributions of how much a country will do to reduce its emissions while it continues to expand fossil fuels. Now, why no one is looking at the solutions that we require? And I'm going to still cite you more data. Last year in 2023, the continent of Africa, out of the 1.8 trillion that was invested in renewables, only got 3%. Just 3% of the total spending on renewables went to the continent that is energy poor, that has contributed the least, that has majority of its population without electricity, and that aspires for greater standard of living like everybody else. So unless we unlock investment towards the solutions, there's no way in hell we will be able to tackle the climate crisis. Now, why is this still happening? One is the cost of capital. It's much more expensive in Africa to actually borrow, to help contribute to solve a problem you didn't create in the first place, because those countries that owe you a climate debt will rather loan you so that they profit out of you as you provide solutions that are also global. So look how the injustice, the cruel irony of how the climate system is set up. That you're inviting countries that are poor, that are vulnerable, to join in the global effort to tackle climate change without sharing the financial means and the technology that they require. You guys remember how the global pandemic, COVID, that we all faced. At that time, that was a global pandemic. But instead of sharing the technology to produce the vaccines, the poor were left last. And we were holding vaccines in the global north, waiting for people to die in the streets of Africa, rather than sharing the vaccine so that we can extend the value of protection. Now we're talking about clean energy, whether it's solar, whether it's geothermal, whether it's wind power. The reason why we need these countries to accelerate and join in the transition is because we've actually overshot the carbon budget. And 20% of the global population have misappropriated 3/4 of the global commons. That is the injustice of climate change, that the rich have largely developed in part by polluting without facing the cost of doing so, and in the process misappropriated the atmospheric space. Now we are in a global agreement where the vulnerable who have contributed the least have to also join in the solution. But you know what's happening? Instead of sharing finance and technology, we'll give you loans.
Yeah.
You'll have to benefit us. The interest that we accrue from you has to enrich us as you contribute to solve a problem we created in the first place. That is the offer we're giving to the developing countries. It can't be right. And that is why in a finance COP, we're not talking about finance. We rightly celebrated when Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, came to the COP and promised to enhance UK's NDC. But you know what that came to those of us in Africa? It's like, an adult coming to a children's party with adult gifts. NDC is next year. We need more NDC ambition. But this year, we need to unlock finance so that we can be able to help inspire greater ambition across the world. Nobody wants to talk about finance. Nobody wants to talk about the reforms of the international financial architecture. Nobody wants to talk about reducing the cost of capital so that we can increase the global ambition.
So I want Susana and Mike to have a chance to address the same question. How can we ensure that the Global South is not left behind? But I want to ask you a quick follow-up question, Mohamed. In Africa, countries are walled off from access to private capital for the energy transition. Why is it that 50% of all the world's investments in fossil fuel is now going to Africa? You have no problem getting financing for, there are more fossil fuel pipelines under construction in Africa today than in North America. I mentioned the list earlier, the LNG terminals, the refineries, the oil wells, the gas wells, all the rest of it. There's absolutely no shortage of financing for that. Maybe the answer to my question is obvious, but I'd like to hear you spell it out. Why is all this money easily available for Africa is it because it's fossil fuel colonialism and that the fossil fuels are due to be mostly exported to the rich countries? Is that the reason for it? But tell me in your words, why is there a shortage of any finance for renewables, but an abundance of finance for fossil fuel development?
So 2 answers. When Putin invaded Ukraine, Europe had what they call an energy crisis. It's like the rest of us who were energy poor didn't have an energy crisis. When Europe, closed the taps of, the oil that was coming in as a result of the invasion, they talked about an energy crisis. What was their response? To turn Africa into their gas station. That's the first problem.
To do what?
Turning Africa into Europe's gas station.
Oh, I see.
So that they can have an alternative source for gas. So that's Europe. Now, the second one is a bigger problem. Is like a drug dealer basically wanting to hook the next generation on the dirty stuff. So as the rest of the world wants to wean itself off fossil fuels because of their long-term net zero plans, they want to hook the energy poor population on the dirty stuff so that they have markets for the dirty stuff. Saudi, ahead of Dubai, was striking deals with Africa. I don't know whether you guys have observed. Saudi hosting a Saudi Africa summit. You've seen that? The investment that Saudi was making, which is also what China has been doing before that, is in big infrastructure projects. So that you have a market for fossil, highways, ports, vehicles, so that you can actually create a market. The way the global society has actually structured Africa's society and economy is the place where you source cheap raw materials and also a market for your finished products. You have no other role. This is how colonialism had structured, unfortunately, Africa. Now, the sad reality is also that instead of African leaders thinking about Africa's best interest, they're thinking about the big ticket projects because they're going to help them stay in power. So if you come and provide big infrastructure financing, if that is going to be fossil, it's most likely than not for leaders to fall for it, and part of it is also corruption.
Yeah.
So there are a number of factors that are playing into that equation that undermines our collective interest. And so the more we expose this scandal, challenge the structures and systems that continue to perpetuate, and offer practical solutions that are actually going to work for Africa and for the planet, the better for us.
Thank you. Well, now, Susana, your president and your country, with your leadership, has taken a really bold approach on stopping the exploitation of the reserves of fossil fuels in Colombia. But answer both parts of this question, if you would. How can we speed up, how can we make sure that the Global South participates in this clean energy revolution? And what can you do, what could other countries do to stop the exploitation of ever more? The IEA, the International Energy Agency, says that we don't need any new fossil fuel development. We've got more than enough to incinerate the planet underway now, but they're developing new ones all over the place. The big banks have put $7 trillion extra in for new fossil fuels since Paris. But tell us what Colombia's done, and what do you think we all can do to speed up the energy transition in the South?
Yes, I think what Mohamed said is absolutely right. There is a structural aspects that are systematically creating this inequality. And I think it went much worse after COVID. So we left COVID highly indebted, and I tell you, like, a reality of a middle-income country. It's not like a country that has no money to pay its debt. But right now, we are paying more in debt in every year's budget than our education budget or our defense budget. And we cannot get one additional peso in debt. So our fiscal capacity is super restricted. Our fiscal capacity is investment capacity is being covered by debt. And at the same time, because of that, we are perceived by the investment rating agencies as a risky country. So our investment rating has been downgraded, and so the access to capital for a country like Colombia is at 10% right now. And that means that it becomes more expensive and more difficult to get the capital that you need to develop whole economic sectors that you need to develop. But on the other hand, internally, we also have regulatory challenges. I think that's an aspect that we should not deny, that we could accelerate the transition and investment on renewables. And so both things, the fiscal situation and at the same time, the high cost of capital inhibit most of the developing world to access these technologies. Now, on the other hand, it will be also fair and as an opportunity that we could reindustrialize or industrialize the countries that have the minerals and that could have also the technology. And this requires certain capacities of the governments and to bring back industrialization policies so that we don't end up in the same trap of exporting the minerals and importing the technology, which is something that is of a high risk. So we could, right now, even with electric vehicles, we are starting to see how we're going to put tariffs on the importation because we want the plants to establish themselves in Colombia, to manufacture in Colombia. That's why we are saying this is not an energy transition, it is an economic transition, and geopolitics are at stake, and the starting points of countries are very unequal. And as a proposal, President Petro has put forward that we make an economic pact, a global economic pact. For example, you could see it with NDBs, with the multilateral development banks, with creditors of debt, with the countries that are developing countries that have to do this transition. Let's have a part of that debt that we have to pay. We can pay it, but in another way. We can pay it by investing in the transition as a way to have more resilient economies to the future and de-risk the processes that we have. But there is no forum to start making this. The Prime Minister of Barbados has put Bridgetown 3.0, which I think is brilliant. President Petro has worked. G20 is going to be meeting next week. But where is the space where we can get a more collective economic process that allows to phase out fossil fuels? And it definitely is not the COP process.
Well, thank you. We're running out of time, so we only have time for one more question. I'm going to start with you, Mike. Next year is an important year. I've mentioned this already. It's the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, and as all of you have made clear, the NDCs are coming due. COP30 is going to be held in Brazil, and I do believe that Lula is committed to getting progress, and Marina Silva is a great ally in Brazil. There are complications, and we know that too. But I'd like the three of you to reflect on what you see as the biggest opportunities for increasing climate action and ambition between now and the end of next year, and what gives you hope in the struggle ahead. Mike, you start off, and then we'll have our other two.
Yeah, I talked previously about the need to get the fossil fuel lobby out of the room, literally and figuratively. But I think on the more optimistic side, and connecting a little bit to what the minister said earlier about the Cali COP, there is a big opportunity over the next year to really focus on building the power of those who need to be heard and whose agendas need to be acted on, need to be in the room, again, literally as well as figuratively. And I'm talking here particularly about indigenous communities, climate justice activists, environmental defenders. This is a huge opportunity, I think, coming up to start to shift that imbalance of power within the debate. We need to get the fossils out, but we need to create space for those constituencies to have their voices heard, agendas acted on. So we're very encouraged by what came out of the Cali COP in terms of that provision for indigenous voices to be heard. We're very excited about the potential of the COP30 in Brazil next year. A lot of support from the Brazilian government to a very nascent initiative around bringing environmental defenders into these spaces, which is called the Leaders Network on Environmental Activists and Defenders. So for me, that is a source of optimism and hope.
Multilateralism is at risk. We know what happened in the US. And I think we need to join forces so that we can be able to protect the global cooperative action on climate while continuously improving. I think those two things need to go hand in hand. It's not perfect, but it's what we have, and we needed to move faster so that we can be able to deliver a safe planet. Now, after doing that part, it's also going to be whether we can be able to actually share the means with those who don't have. This idea of only thinking of climate through the very narrow prism of a carbon dioxide molecule is not going to deliver us. I think we need to think big picture. We need economic transformation. And for those who are still developing, I think we need to reframe this as an opportunity. And that opportunity is what is going to help us actually hold warming to within safe levels. So that means whether it's finance or technology. And you can do that if you only have it between the states, and the states also open it to the fossil fuel lobbyists. None of us will ever imagine having big tobacco in a meeting that is going to discuss how we tackle lung cancer. Why are we still letting these fossil fuel lobbyists? So there is something I think that is fundamentally wrong that we need to actually address, and we can only do that if we collectively shine the spotlight, not just through our individual agency, but by mobilizing the people of this planet. And as a climate community, I think we've been narrowly focused on the COP bubble. I think we need to try and translate our message, including the scientific message, and look at where that interacts with the indigenous people's knowledge so that we can mobilize the masses to get serious about climate. So I think getting out of the climate bubble in the COP so that the folks on the streets feel that what we're doing is in our collective interest is what is going to help us win. And Brazil, as the home to Rio that gave us this convention, is perhaps the place to help rewrite some of the historic wrongs.
Thank you. Susana, you have the last word, then I'm going to have a few closing remarks.
In terms of what gives me hope, I agree very much that is people mobilization. And what I felt at COP16 is that we sparkled something that is deep, and that's the energy that will mobilize this change. And it was the connection to life, to nature. Because there is something that you can relate to. Everybody has a river, a tree, a place that you love, that is fundamentally part of who you are. And when we call this mobilization, we call it the Peace with Nature coalition, when you give life to nature, where nature becomes a subject and you relate to it, you change your relationship to nature, then the climate crisis can be defendable by common people. Because that's what is at stake, is life itself. It's not the molecule of CO2, it's not this very complex science, but people can see and can relate more easily the crisis when your relationship with nature changes. So that gave me a lot of hope, what we were able to mobilize and sparkle because of that fundamental relationship. And it's also a way where everybody can participate. Everybody can have access to that. And as we see that we love being destroyed, and also ourselves being destroyed, we're going to react. And I found there an opportunity which I hope we can continue working on.
You know, a great American philosopher and leader, now passed, Thomas Berry, wrote this sentence: "The universe is not a collection of objects, it's a communion of subjects." That embodies, in my mind, the shift in thinking that you were able to embody in COP16, so I congratulate you again. I want to close by saying that the Climate Reality Project is going to have a training in Brazil well before COP30 next year. We're also going to have a training in East Africa and Kenya in the summer, in June of next year. We're going to have also a training in Paris to start the year in Q1, well, in March of next year. Looking forward to that, and a training in Mongolia also. And for all of you who are part of the Climate Reality Project, I want you to look forward to one or more of those if you can come. I just want to extend my deepest gratitude to these great panelists. I'll come back at the end of my comments and ask you to join me in thanking them. I don't know if I've ever been part of a better panel than this panel here. I've learned so much from these people. Thank you so much. My goodness, it really was great. I know that people in this audience work hard every day, and just as the Climate Reality's 3.5 million person global network does to make the needed progress. But I'd like to ask you to do two more things, if you'd please consider these two things. First, add your name to the Climate Reality Project's Dear World Leaders online petition that demands world leaders act to phase out fossil fuels quickly and accelerate the transition to clean energy. Second, tell your country's leadership not to give oil and gas representatives a seat at the negotiating table in Brazil by making them part of the delegation, and continue to press for the future we all want and the future that our grandchildren and those who come after need. I want to thank all of you for coming here today and participating. I look forward to the reception, but I would like to close, as I previewed, by asking all of you to join me in thanking these great panelists, Mike Davis, Mohamed, Adow, and Minister Susana Mohamed. Thank you very much.